February 14, 1944, London, England. A cramped apartment above a tea shop. Juan Pujol García sits hunched over a radio transmitter, tapping out coded messages that will decide the fate of the world. The Germans call him Arabel, their most trusted spy, but they have no idea he's actually working for the British. His codename Garbo. For months, he's been feeding Hitler's intelligence chiefs exactly what they want to hear: detailed reports about a massive Allied army gathering in southeast England, ready to invade at Pas de Calais. 27 fictional agents supposedly work under him, sending reports that seem so real, so convincing, that the German High Command stakes everything on his information. But here's what's truly shocking. While Garbo spins his web of lies, American factories are producing weapons and vehicles at a rate that defies imagination. The deception only works because America's industrial might makes even the fake armies seem believable. What happens when the real invasion comes? Will Hitler's forces be in the right place at the wrong time? And how did one man's imagination help change the course of history? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The hiss of radio static filled the cramped London flat as Juan Pujol García adjusted his headphones. February rain drummed against the windows of his modest apartment above a tea shop in Hendon. The air carried the scent of damp wool and coal smoke from the fireplace that barely warmed the small room. Garbo, as British intelligence knew him, hunched over his transmitter, fingers poised above the brass telegraph key that would soon send another masterpiece of deception across occupied Europe. This was no ordinary evening transmission. Garcia had spent hours crafting tonight's message, weaving together fragments of truth with elaborate fiction. His 27 imaginary agents, each with carefully constructed backgrounds and personalities, would report on Allied troop movements that existed only in his remarkable imagination. To the German intelligence officers in Madrid who received his coded transmissions, these reports painted a picture of inexorable Allied preparation for invasion. The Spaniard took a deep breath and began tapping ... The message traveled through the ether to Madrid, where Spanish collaborators would relay it to Berlin. In his report, Agent 3 described seeing American armored divisions moving through Kent toward Dover. Agent 7 reported increased activity at the port of London, with landing craft being loaded under cover of darkness. Agent 14, supposedly a secretary in the British War Office, had overheard discussions about General George Smith Patton Jr.'s 1st United States Army Group, preparing for the main assault on the Pas de Calais. Every detail was false. Every statistic was fabricated. Yet the Germans believed completely. Garcia paused between transmissions, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. Outside London endured another night of blackout. But here, in this small room, the fate of Operation Overlord hung on his ability to convince Hitler's intelligence chiefs that the main Allied invasion would strike 150 miles northeast of where it actually would land. By early 1944, Garbo had transmitted over 300 messages to his German handlers. His fictional network had grown so complex that British intelligence officers struggled to keep track of all the imaginary personalities he had created. The Germans not only believed in his spy ring, they paid him for it. Money arrived regularly through Portuguese banks, funding an operation that would help seal Nazi Germany's doom. The genius of Garcia's deception lay not just in his imagination, but in the broader context of Allied industrial might that made his lies believable. When he reported seeing hundreds of Sherman tanks moving toward Dover, German intelligence officers nodded in recognition. American factories were indeed producing Sherman tanks at rates that seemed impossible, 49,234 by war's end. When his fictional agents described endless convoys of supplies, German analysts accepted this as consistent with American industrial capacity they had witnessed through captured equipment and prisoners. Interrogations as Garcia finished his transmission and signed off with his personal code, the message began its journey. Within hours, German officers in Berlin would study his reports alongside reconnaissance photographs and radio intercepts. They would see confirmation of what they desperately wanted to believe, that the Allies planned their main invasion at the Pas de Calais, where German defenses were strongest and the English Channel narrowest. The irony was profound. While Garcia invented fictional armies, real American industrial power made those inventions credible. While he created imaginary landing craft, American shipyards produced actual vessels at rates that dwarfed anything in military history. His deception succeeded because American abundance provided the backdrop against which even his wildest fabrication seemed plausible. 3,000 miles west of Garcia's London flat, the night shift was just beginning at the River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan. The massive Ford Motor Company facility had transformed from automobile production to the business of total war. Under banks of harsh electric lights, men and women in coveralls moved with purposeful urgency along assembly lines that never stopped. The sound was deafening, metal hammering against metal, rivet guns chattering, welders sending cascades of sparks across the factory floor. The air was thick with the smell of hot oil, burning metal, and industrial lubricants. Women who had never worked outside their homes now operated massive hydraulic presses that stamped armor plating for Sherman tanks. Men who had built civilian cars now assembled the engines that would power Boeing B-24 Liberator bombers. Shift supervisor Robert Mitchell checked his clipboard as another completed tank rolled off the production line. This was number 47 for the day, and they had 8 hours remaining before the morning shift arrived. The mathematics of American war production had become staggering by early 1944. Ford alone was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. General Motors was building aircraft engines, tanks, artillery shells, and landing craft simultaneously across dozens of facilities. The numbers told a story that German intelligence officers could barely comprehend. In 1944, American factories would produce 96,318 aircraft. German factories, crippled by Allied bombing and material shortages, would manage fewer than 40,000. American shipyards were launching a new vessel every day: destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, and the Liberty ships that would carry millions of tons of supplies to Europe. Mitchell walked past a row of newly completed M4 Sherman tanks, their steel hulls gleaming under the factory lights. Each tank represented 25 tons of American steel, aluminum, and industrial precision. German Panzer production peaked at barely 300 tanks per month across all factories. Ford's single facility in Detroit was producing more armored vehicles than all of Germany's tank plants combined. The abundance created possibilities that went far beyond simple numerical superiority. When British intelligence officers approached American military planners about Operation Fortitude, the deception plan designed to convince Germans that the main invasion would strike at Pas de Calais, they discovered that American production capacity could support elaborate fictional armies with actual equipment. Dummy. Landing craft could be built because American shipyards had surplus capacity. Inflatable tanks could be manufactured because rubber and canvas were available in quantities that German quartermasters could only dream of possessing. Radio equipment for fake military units existed because American electronics production had expanded exponentially since 1941. Margaret Sullivan adjusted her welding mask and returned to work on a tank hull. She had 3 sons serving overseas, one in the Pacific with the Navy, 2 in Europe with the Army. Every Sherman tank that rolled off this line might be the one that brought them home safely. The factory workers understood their role in the larger strategy, even if they could not know the specific details of Garcia's deception operation. By the time Mitchell's shift ended at dawn, Ford's River Rouge complex would have completed another 53 tanks, contributed components for 28 aircraft, and produced enough artillery shells to supply an entire division for a week. Across America, similar scenes played out in hundreds of factories operating around the clock. This industrial abundance provided the foundation for Garcia's elaborate deception. When he reported fictional American divisions moving toward Dover, German intelligence officers accepted his reports because they understood American productive capacity made such large-scale movements entirely possible. The lies worked because the underlying truth, American industrial supremacy, was undeniable. In occupied Paris, the ornate headquarters of Army Group B hummed with nervous energy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's staff officers bent over maps spread across mahogany tables that had once graced elegant French salons. The morning briefing was beginning, and the latest intelligence reports from Britain demanded immediate attention. Oberst Friedrich von Dröne, head of Foreign Armies West, stood before a large map of the English Channel. Red pins marked suspected Allied troop concentrations based on agent reports, radio intercepts, and reconnaissance flights. The pattern seemed clear, a massive buildup in Kent and Sussex, directly across from the Pas de Calais. Cigarette smoke clouded the room as officers studied the data that would shape German defensive strategy. "Gentlemen," von Roena began, his voice carrying the authority of Prussian military tradition, "our most reliable agent in Britain has provided additional confirmation. The 1st United States Army Group under General Patton continues to concentrate forces opposite Calais. Latest reports indicate at least 50 divisions preparing for the main assault." The officers nodded. Agent Arabel, Garcia's German code name, had proven consistently accurate since 1942. His network provided detailed information that matched other intelligence sources. When Arabel reported American tank movements, reconnaissance flights would spot vehicle concentrations in roughly the same areas. When his agents described increased radio traffic, German listening posts would detect corresponding signals. The consistency was remarkable. What the German officers could not know was that British intelligence carefully orchestrated this consistency. Real tank movements were timed to support Garcia's fictional reports. Actual radio transmissions were designed to reinforce his fabricated army group. The deception worked because it blended truth with lies so skillfully that even experienced intelligence analysts could not separate them. Rommel himself studied the map with growing concern. The Pas de Calais represented the most logical invasion route, the shortest sea crossing, the closest to German industrial centers, the most direct path to the Reich's heartland. Yet something troubled him about the intelligence picture. Allied bombing had intensified against targets throughout Normandy. Coastal defenses in Normandy reported increased reconnaissance activity. These indicators suggested Allied interest in areas far from the suspected main landing zones. "What of the Normandy sector?" Rommel asked, pointing to the coastline west of Calais. 7th Army reports continued Allied reconnaissance and bombing activities. Von Roena consulted his files. Agent Arabel addresses this specifically, Herr Feldmarschall. His sources indicate these activities are deliberate deception measures designed to draw our attention from the main assault at Calais. The Normandy operations are secondary, perhaps a diversionary landing at most. The assessment seemed logical. Allied deception capabilities were well known to German intelligence. The British had successfully misled German forces about the timing and location of the North. African landings in 1942. They had concealed the true objectives of the Sicily invasion in 1943. German officers expected extensive deception measures before any cross-channel attack. What they failed to recognize was the scale of American industrial capacity supporting these deception operations. When Garcia's agents reported massive supply concentrations in Kent, German analysts accepted these reports because American production statistics suggested such accumulations were entirely feasible. United States factories were producing military equipment at rates that exceeded German intelligence estimates. By spring 1944, American industry had delivered over 200,000 military vehicles to Europe. The logistics system supporting Allied forces in Britain handled tonnages that dwarfed anything in German experience. Against this backdrop of genuine abundance, Garcia's fictional army seemed completely credible. The morning briefing concluded with renewed confidence in German defensive preparations. 15th Army would remain concentrated in the Pas de Calais sector, positioned to meet Patton's fictitious army group. Armor reserves would be positioned to respond quickly to the expected main assault. Normandy would receive sufficient forces to repel diversionary attacks, but the primary focus remained on defending the most likely and most logical invasion route. As officers filed out of the briefing room, none suspected that their most trusted intelligence source was actually their enemy's greatest asset. Garcia's deception had become so integral to German planning that questioning it seemed equivalent to questioning basic military logic. The trap was set, baited with American industrial abundance and German preconceptions about Allied strategy. The London rain had turned to sleet by the time Garcia began his evening transmission in late April 1944. His small flat felt even more cramped as the weather-trapped cigarette smoke and the metallic odor of his radio equipment. Tonight's message would be particularly important. Reconnaissance reports from his fictional Agent 5. Supposedly stationed near Dover, Garcia had spent the afternoon carefully crafting the intelligence that would soon cross occupied Europe. Agent 5 had observed increased activity at dummy airfields near Dover, where wooden aircraft sat in neat rows designed to fool German reconnaissance cameras. Agent 12 had counted landing craft in Portsmouth Harbor, real vessels mixed with inflatable decoys that looked convincing from high altitude. Agent 23 reported overhearing American officers discussing final preparations for Operation Fortitude North, the fictional invasion of Norway that would draw German attention away from France entirely. Each fabricated detail supported the larger deception. Garcia's imaginary network had grown so sophisticated that British intelligence officers maintained detailed files on every fictional agent, tracking their supposed movements and relationships to maintain consistency. The operation had become a bureaucratic marvel, hundreds of real people supporting the activities of 27 people who existed only in Garcia's imagination. The radio crackled to life as Garcia began transmitting. His message described General Patton reviewing troops in Kent, where the 1st United States Army Group continued its fictional preparations. The report mentioned specific unit designations, equipment concentrations, and supply movements that British intelligence had carefully choreographed to support the illusion. Across the channel, German listening posts recorded Garcia's transmission for immediate relay to Berlin. Within hours, intelligence analysts would study his latest reports alongside reconnaissance photographs and prisoner interrogations. The pattern would seem clear. Allied forces were massing for a major assault, but not at Normandy. The genius of Operation Fortitude lay in its exploitation of German logical thinking. German staff officers understood that the Allies possessed overwhelming material advantages by 1944. American Lend-Lease shipments had transformed British military capabilities. Soviet forces had demonstrated remarkable resilience despite catastrophic early losses. The logical conclusion was that Allied commanders would concentrate their superior resources at the most advantageous point, the narrow Dover-Calais crossing. Garcia's deception worked because it told German intelligence officers what they already believed. The fictional 1st United States Army Group under Patton seemed entirely credible because American industrial capacity could easily support such a force. When Garcia reported seeing endless convoys of Sherman tanks moving toward Dover, German analysts accepted this as consistent with American production figures they had observed through captured equipment and prisoner statements. The numbers supporting Garcia's lies were staggering. By spring 1944, American factories had produced over 100,000 tanks and self-propelled artillery pieces. Shipyards had launched more than 5,000 landing craft specifically designed for amphibious operations. Aircraft production exceeded 8,000 planes per month, providing the air superiority necessary for any cross-channel invasion. Against this backdrop of genuine abundance, Garcia's fictional army seemed completely plausible. When he reported that Agent 14 had seen supply depots containing hundreds of thousands of artillery shells, German intelligence officers nodded in recognition. American ammunition production exceeded German output by ratios that seemed almost impossible to believe. The The operation had expanded far beyond Garcia's small London flat. Allied engineers were constructing dummy installations throughout southeast England, fake airfields with wooden aircraft, inflatable tanks arranged in realistic formations, and even dummy oil pipeline terminals designed to suggest massive fuel requirements for the fictional assault. American production capacity made these elaborate deceptions feasible because real equipment could be diverted to support fictional operations without compromising actual military preparations. As Garcia concluded his transmission and carefully stored his radio equipment, the message began its journey through the German intelligence system. By morning, officers in Berlin would be studying his latest reports, adding new pins to their maps, and adjusting defensive plans to meet the anticipated assault at Pas de Calais. The irony was perfect. German intelligence officers were making logical decisions based on accurate assessments of American industrial capacity. Their error lay not in misunderstanding Allied capabilities, but in trusting the one source that consistently confirmed their preconceptions while leading them steadily towards strategic disaster. The Ruhr Valley presented a landscape of devastation by late April 1944. What had once been the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany now resembled a moonscape of craters, twisted steel, and abandoned machinery. The Krupp Armaments Works in Essen, once capable of producing hundreds of tanks monthly, operated at less than 30% capacity. Allied bombing had transformed German industry from a source of strength into a monument to scarcity. Friedrich Müller surveyed the damage from his office window in what remained of the Thyssen steel plant. As production director for armored vehicle manufacturing, he faced impossible demands with dwindling resources. The latest requisition from Army Group B called for 200 Panzer IV tanks to reinforce defenses in the Pas de Calais. Miller could promise perhaps 30 tanks within the next 2 months, assuming steel allocations continued and bombing raids did not destroy additional production facilities. The statistics were becoming desperate. German tank production peaked at barely 400 units per month across all factories. Meanwhile, intelligence reports suggested American factories were producing over 1,000 tanks monthly from individual facilities. The Ford Motor Company's single plant in Detroit apparently outproduced all of German armor manufacturing combined. Müller walked through the factory floor, stepping around puddles of rainwater that leaked through bomb-damaged roofing. Half the machine tools sat idle, lacking spare parts that could no longer be manufactured or imported. The workers who remained were increasingly comprised of foreign conscripts and elderly German men whose sons had been consumed by the Eastern Front. Quality control had become impossible when survival demanded accepting any product that remotely resembled military equipment. The material shortages affected every aspect of production. Armor steel required specific alloys that were no longer available in sufficient quantities. Rubber for tank tracks had to be manufactured from synthetic materials that degraded rapidly under combat conditions. Electronic components for tank radios and rangefinders were so scarce that many vehicles left the factory with equipment removed from damaged units returned from the front. Most critical was the fuel situation. German synthetic fuel production, once a source of strategic independence, had been systematically targeted by Allied bombers. The Luna synthetic fuel plant, which had produced over 200,000 tons of aviation gasoline annually, now operated sporadically between air raids. Tank crews trained on vehicles with enough fuel for basic maneuvers, then went into combat with half-empty fuel tanks and no prospect of refueling. The contrast with American production was becoming impossible to ignore. Prisoners captured during recent fighting described American supply lines that seemed almost fantastical to German logistics officers. American tank crews reportedly received fresh vehicles to replace battle losses within days. Ammunition supplies were so abundant that American artillery units fired preparatory barrages that consumed more shells in single engagements than German. Factories could produce in months. Muller's assistant approached with the latest production report. "Herr Director, We completed 8 Panzer IVs this week. 3 required immediate repairs due to substandard steel in the final drive assemblies. 2 lack proper radio equipment. All have synthetic rubber tracks that field commanders report last less than 100 kilometers under combat conditions. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The numbers told a story of industrial collapse. Germany's total tank production for 1944 would barely exceed 8,000 vehicles. American factories would produce over 25,000 tanks during the same period, while Soviet industry would contribute another 29,000. The mathematical reality was stark. Germany was attempting to fight a 3-front war with industrial capacity less than 1/5 that of its enemies combined. Yet German intelligence officers continued to plan defenses based on assumptions of relative strength. Reports from Agent Arabel in Britain suggested Allied forces were concentrating for a single massive assault at the Pas de Calais. German planners accepted these reports because they fitted their understanding of Allied material advantages. The logical strategy was to concentrate overwhelming force at the point of maximum advantage. What they failed to recognize was that American abundance made such concentration unnecessary. Allied forces could sustain major operations simultaneously across multiple fronts because American production exceeded consumption by enormous margins. The deception worked precisely because German officers, conditioned by their own scarcity, could not imagine the scale of Allied material superiority. The Kent coastline in early June 1944 presented a masterpiece of military deception. From the Dover cliffs, the assembled fleet looked formidable enough to invade a continent. Hundreds of landing craft bobbed at anchor in the channel, their gray hulls dark against the choppy water. Aircraft lined nearby airfields in precise formations, wings glinting in the pale English sunlight. Supply dumps stretched inland from the beaches, covered by camouflage netting that failed to conceal their enormous scope. To German reconnaissance pilots flying high overhead, the scene confirmed every report from Agent Arabel. General Patton's 1st United States Army Group appeared ready for the greatest amphibious assault in military history. The intelligence fitted perfectly with German expectations. Allied forces were concentrating overwhelming superiority at the most logical point of attack. The reality was far more complex. Colonel David Strangeways of the Royal Engineers supervised the construction of Operation Quicksilver, the physical component of the Fortitude deception. His teams had spent months creating an elaborate theater set designed to fool German cameras and confirm Garcia's fictional reports. The landing craft were real enough, mostly obsolete vessels and specially constructed decoys. The aircraft were plywood and canvas, painted to look convincing from 3,000 feet altitude. The supply dumps contained genuine materials mixed with empty crates and dummy equipment. The operation required enormous resources that only Allied industrial abundance could provide. Real steel had been diverted to construct dummy landing craft. Actual rubber was used for inflatable tanks that looked authentic from German observation posts across the Channel. American production capacity was so vast that supporting elaborate deceptions became feasible without compromising actual military preparations. Strangeways checked his watch as another German reconnaissance plane appeared high overhead. His crews had learned to time their activities to German flight schedules, ensuring that observers would see maximum activity during known surveillance periods. Workers would emerge from concealed positions to move equipment, simulate loading operations, and maintain the illusion of constant preparation. The inflatable tanks were particularly impressive. Sherman tank replicas, constructed from rubber and canvas, looked convincing enough to fool experienced German photo interpreters. American rubber production exceeded German stockpiles by ratios that made such elaborate deceptions economically feasible. Each dummy tank cost less than a German army spent on fuel. For a single day of tank training, the scale of the deception reflected Allied material. advantages that German intelligence officers found difficult to fully comprehend. When Garcia reported seeing hundreds of tanks moving toward Dover, his fictional observations were supported by actual equipment. Concentrations that seemed enormous by German standards yet represented only a small fraction of Allied production capacity. American engineer units had constructed over 40 dummy airfields throughout southeast England, each equipped with wooden aircraft, fake fuel storage facilities, and simulated maintenance hangars. The engineering effort required thousands of workers and millions of board feet of lumber, resources that would have represented major industrial commitments for Germany, but were readily available to American forces. The dummy installations were maintained with extraordinary attention to detail. Aircraft were repositioned periodically to simulate normal base operations. Vehicles moved between installations to suggest realistic logistics activities. Radio transmissions from each fictional unit followed, carefully scripted schedules that German listening posts would interpret as evidence of massive military preparations. The most remarkable aspect of Quicksilver was its integration with genuine military activities. Real Allied forces continued training exercises near the dummy installations, creating radar signatures and radio traffic that supported the overall deception. American supply lines delivered actual equipment to areas near the fictional concentrations, ensuring that German intelligence would observe the logistical activities necessary to support large-scale operations. As evening approached, Strangeways observed German reconnaissance flights returning across the Channel. Tonight, photo interpreters in occupied France would study images that confirmed Garcia's latest reports. They would count landing craft, measure supply concentrations, and estimate troop numbers based on carefully orchestrated visual evidence. The deception succeeded because it exploited German logical assumptions about Allied strategy and capabilities. German officers understood that American industrial production provided overwhelming material advantages. They recognized that Allied commanders would concentrate these advantages at the point of maximum strategic benefit. Garcia's reports and Quicksilver's physical evidence confirmed what German intelligence officers already believed. The main assault would come at the most logical location. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke gray and forbidding over the Normandy coast as the greatest armada in military history approached the beaches. Through the pre-dawn darkness, over 5,000 ships had crossed the English Channel, carrying 156,000 Allied soldiers toward their destiny. The thunder of naval gunfire rolled across the water as battleships and cruisers pounded German coastal defenses with shells weighing as much as small automobiles. On Omaha Beach, the first landing craft ground against the sandy shore as machine gun fire erupted from German fortifications on the bluffs above. American soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division stumbled through the surf, weighed down by equipment and the knowledge that everything depended on the next few hours. Many would not see sunset, but their sacrifice would open the gateway to European liberation. The scale of the assault dwarfed anything in military history. 10,000 aircraft provided air cover and close support, ranging from massive Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers to nimble Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. Allied naval gunfire delivered more high, explosive tonnage in the first hour than German. Artillery had fired during entire weeks on the Eastern Front. The material abundance that made such concentrated firepower possible reflected American industrial capacity that German planners had consistently underestimated. Meanwhile, in his London flat, Garcia transmitted the most important message of his career. Agent 4 reported that the Normandy landings appeared to be a diversionary operation designed to draw German reserves away from the Pas de Calais. Agent 7 confirmed that General Patton's 1st United States Army Group remained in Kent, apparently preparing for the main assault. Agent 12 had overheard American officers describing Normandy as Operation Bodyguard, a preliminary action to precede the decisive blow. Every word was fabricated, but German intelligence officers in Berlin received Garcia's reports with enormous relief. The Normandy assault, while larger than expected for a diversionary operation, confirmed their strategic assessment. Allied forces were clearly attempting to draw German reserves away from the strongest defensive positions. The logical response was to contain the Normandy bridgehead while maintaining defensive strength in the Pas de Calais. In Normandy, German defenders fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds. The 7th Army under General Friedrich Dollmann faced Allied forces equipped with material advantages that seemed almost fantastical. American artillery units fired more ammunition in single barrages than German factories could produce in weeks. Allied aircraft dominated the skies so completely that German reinforcements could move only under cover of darkness. The contrast between Allied abundance and German scarcity was stark and decisive. American landing craft delivered fresh supplies continuously throughout the day, replacing equipment losses and maintaining the momentum of the assault. German defenders fought with whatever ammunition they possessed when the attack began, knowing that resupply was unlikely and reinforcement impossible. By evening, Allied forces had established precarious footholds on all 5 landing beaches. The cost had been enormous, over 4,000 casualties on Omaha Beach alone, but the strategic objective was achieved. German reserves remained immobilized by Garcia's deception, convinced that the main assault was yet to come. Civilian populations in Norman villages found themselves caught between the retreating Germans and advancing Allies. Marie Leblanc, a teacher in Sainte-Mère-Église, would later recall the sound of American paratroopers landing around her home during the early morning hours. "We had waited 4 years for liberation," she remembered, "but we never imagined it would be so violent, so overwhelming." The logistical achievement of D-Day reflected American industrial capabilities that German intelligence had observed but never fully appreciated. The invasion fleet included specialized vessels designed specifically for amphibious operations, tank landing ships, artillery barges, floating dry docks, and even concrete harbors that would be towed across the Channel to provide port facilities on the Norman beaches. As reports of the landings reached Berlin, German High Command faced a critical decision. Should armor reserves be committed to crush the Normandy bridgehead, or should they remain positioned to meet the anticipated main assault at Calais? Garcia's continuing reports provided the answer. Normandy was a diversion. The real invasion was yet to come. That decision, based on Garcia's masterful deception and German faith in logical military planning, would prove to be one of the most consequential strategic errors in military history. 15 miles inland from the Pas de Calais beaches, the 2nd Panzer Division waited in positions they had occupied since March. Colonel Hans von Luck commanded a Kampfgruppe of tanks, mechanized infantry, and artillery that represented one of Germany's most experienced armored formations. His soldiers had fought across North Africa and Russia, surviving campaigns that had destroyed dozens of other units. Now they waited for an invasion that would never come. The morning radio reports from Normandy troubled von Luck's staff officers. Allied forces appeared to be landing in much greater strength than expected for a diversionary operation. Aerial reconnaissance suggested hundreds of ships offshore, with additional convoys arriving continuously. The scale seemed enormous for what German intelligence had characterized as a secondary assault. Yet Agent Arabel's latest reports from Britain provided reassuring context. The fictional 1st United States Army Group remained concentrated in Kent, apparently delayed by weather conditions that had also affected the Normandy operation. General Patton's forces would strike the Pas de Calais within days, requiring German armor reserves to remain in position to meet the main threat. Von Luck studied reconnaissance photographs showing Allied activities in southeast England. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Hundreds of landing craft concentrated near Dover, massive supply dumps visible despite camouflage efforts, and aircraft formations that suggested major air operations in preparation. The intelligence fitted perfectly with basic military logic. Allied commanders possessed overwhelming material superiority. They would concentrate that superiority at the point of maximum strategic advantage. The colonel walked among his Panzer IV tanks, checking equipment and maintaining morale among crews who had been waiting for battle since dawn. Each tank represented months of German industrial effort and increasingly scarce strategic materials. The 43 tanks under his command constituted a significant portion of German armor reserves in northwestern France. Every vehicle was precious, irreplaceable, if lost in premature action. German logistics officers had calculated that armor reserves could reach the Normandy beaches within 6 hours of receiving movement orders. The distance was manageable, fuel supplies were adequate for the journey, and French road networks could support rapid deployment. Yet High Command insisted that armor remain positioned to meet the primary threat at Calais. The decision reflected German confidence in their intelligence assessment, reinforced by Garcia's continuing reports and the overwhelming physical evidence of Allied preparations in Kent. German staff officers could not imagine that Allied industrial abundance made elaborate deceptions feasible while simultaneously supporting massive actual operations in multiple locations. Radio intercepts from the Normandy sector painted an increasingly dire picture. German defenders reported Allied artillery fire of unprecedented intensity. American tank units were advancing inland despite determined resistance. Allied air superiority was so complete that German movement during daylight hours had become impossible. Yet Berlin remained convinced that these developments represented diversionary actions. Von Luck's battalion commanders gathered for the afternoon briefing in a farmhouse that served as temporary headquarters. Major Weber, commanding the mechanized infantry, expressed growing concern about the Normandy situation. Herr Oberst, the radio report suggests Allied forces are committing far more resources than we would expect for a secondary operation. The colonel consulted his intelligence files. Army Group B assessment remains unchanged, Major. Allied forces are attempting to draw our reserves away from the main objective. Agent Arabel's latest reports confirm that General Patton's Army Group remains concentrated opposite our positions. We must be prepared to move within hours when the primary assault begins. The German assessment was logical, based on accurate understanding of Allied capabilities and seemingly reliable intelligence from their most trusted agent in Britain. What German officers could not recognize was that American industrial production made their logical assumptions irrelevant. Allied forces could sustain major operations simultaneously at multiple locations because American output exceeded consumption by enormous margins. Throughout the afternoon, reports from Normandy became increasingly urgent. German commanders pleaded for armor reserves to prevent Allied consolidation of the beachheads. Yet 15th Army remained immobilized by orders to maintain defensive positions against the anticipated main assault. Garcia's deception had paralyzed German strategic response at the critical moment. As evening approached, von Luck observed Allied reconnaissance aircraft flying high overhead, photographing German positions that had remained unchanged since morning. The irony was profound. German armor waited motionless while actual Allied forces expanded their foothold in Normandy, supported by the industrial abundance that made Garcia's fictional armies seem credible. The Ford River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, operated at maximum capacity throughout the summer of 1944. The factory floors shook with the rhythm of industrial production that dwarfed anything in human history. Where civilian automobiles had once rolled off assembly lines, an endless stream of Sherman tanks, aircraft engines, and military vehicles now emerged to feed the Allied war machine. Production supervisor William Harrison checked his daily reports with satisfaction. Today's output included 67 M4 Sherman tanks, components for 85 aircraft engines, and enough artillery shells to supply an entire armored division for a week. Similar numbers were being achieved at General Motors facilities in Detroit, Chrysler plants in Indiana, and hundreds of other factories across the American Midwest. The statistics were staggering. By summer 1944, American industry was producing military equipment at rates that seemed impossible to European observers. Tank production alone exceeded 1,000 units monthly from multiple facilities. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines at rates approaching 300 per day. Ammunition production had reached levels that allowed American artillery units to fire preparatory barrages, consuming more shells in single engagements than German. Factories could produce in months. The abundance was so vast that supporting elaborate deception operations became economically feasible. Real steel was diverted to construct dummy landing craft for Operation Quicksilver. Actual rubber was used to manufacture inflatable tanks that looked convincing from German reconnaissance aircraft. American production capacity was so overwhelming that these diversions represented insignificant fractions of total output. Margaret O'Brien adjusted her welding mask and returned to work on a tank hull destined for the European theater of operations. She had received a letter from her son Robert, serving with the 3rd Armored Division in France, describing the abundance of American equipment arriving at Norman ports. "Every day brings more tanks, more trucks, more ammunition than we can possibly use," he had written. "The Germans fight bravely, but they cannot match American production." The contrast with German industrial capacity was becoming impossible to ignore. Intelligence reports suggested that all German tank factories combined produced fewer armored vehicles monthly than individual American plants. German ammunition shortages had become so severe that artillery units were rationed to a handful of shells per day. Fuel scarcity limited German tank training to essential maneuvers, while American crews received unlimited fuel for extended exercises. Harrison walked past a row of newly completed Sherman tanks, their steel hulls gleaming under the factory lights. Each tank represented technological advantages that German industry could no longer match. American armor steel was superior to German alternatives. American tank engines were more reliable and easier to maintain. American electronics provided communications and fire control capabilities that exceeded anything available to German forces. The logistical implications were equally decisive. American factories produced spare parts in quantities that allowed field maintenance units to completely rebuild damaged vehicles. German tank crews fought with whatever equipment they possessed, knowing that replacement parts were unavailable and replacement vehicles unlikely. American supply lines delivered fresh equipment to replace battle losses within days. German units committed their remaining tanks, knowing that losses were permanent. Loading docks at American ports presented scenes of abundance that defied comprehension. Liberty ships lined the wharves, taking on cargoes of tanks, artillery, trucks, aircraft, and millions of tons of supplies destined for European battlefields. A single convoy carried more military equipment than German forces possessed in entire army groups. The mathematical reality was stark and decisive. Total Allied production exceeded German output by ratios that made military resistance ultimately futile. American factories alone were producing more aircraft annually than German industry had built throughout the entire war. Soviet tank production, supported by American materials through Lend-Lease agreements, exceeded German armor output by margins approaching 10-1. Yet, Garcia's deception continued to influence German strategic planning because it exploited logical assumptions about Allied concentration of superior resources. German intelligence officers recognized American material advantages, but assumed Allied commanders would concentrate those advantages at single decisive points. The possibility that American abundance made simultaneous major operations feasible exceeded German conceptual frameworks. As Harrison's shift ended and the night crew took over, the factory continued its relentless production. Somewhere in Normandy, American tank crews were advancing inland, supported by unlimited supplies and overwhelming firepower. The industrial abundance that made Garcia's fictional armies credible was now demonstrating its real power on the battlefields of France. July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra began with the roar of 3,000 Allied bombers saturating German defensive positions south of St. Lo. The concentrated bombing represented more explosive tonnage than Germany had dropped on Britain during the entire Blitz. For 90 minutes, wave after wave of Boeing B-17, Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator bombers pounded German lines with precision that left entire unit formations obliterated. General Omar Bradley observed the bombardment from his command post. Knowing that American air superiority had reached levels that made such massive operations routine, the 9th Air Force alone possessed more bombers than the entire German Luftwaffe. Allied fighter aircraft dominated French skies so completely that German reconnaissance flights had become suicide missions. The mathematical advantages were overwhelming and decisive. Colonel Heinrich von Choltitz commanded the German Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's finest armored formations, positioned directly in the path of the American assault. His unit had arrived in Normandy at half strength due to fuel shortages and equipment losses during the journey from reserve positions. Now it faced the full weight of American material superiority concentrated at a single point. The bombing was unlike anything von Choltitz had experienced, even on the Eastern Front. American bombers flew in perfect formation, their escorts sweeping German fighters from the sky. Precision strikes destroyed communications, supply lines, and entire companies. When the bombardment ended, Sherman tanks advanced in overwhelming numbers, supported by artillery barrages, consuming more shells in hours than Germans had for entire campaigns. The breakthrough came quickly. German defenses, shattered by bombing, collapsed under the concentrated assault. American tank columns poured through, advancing 15 miles in a single day. In Berlin, High Command realized the disaster, yet reserves remained in Pas de Calais, waiting for Garcia's fictional invasion. If deployed earlier, they might have slowed the Allies, but the deception ensured Allied success. Von Choltitz attempted a withdrawal with depleted forces, half his tanks gone, fuel and ammunition exhausted, communications severed. Against him moved the U.S. 4th Armored Division, supplied with endless fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity was decisive. American production underpinned this supremacy. Analysts at the War Production Board recorded staggering figures. In June 1944, over 1,400 aircraft and 1,200 tanks rolled off U.S. assembly lines. Annual production exceeded 119,000 aircraft compared to fewer than 40,000 German. Ammunition output surpassed 40 billion rounds a year, while Germany produced less than 1 billion. Shipyards launched new vessels daily, from carriers to Liberty ships sustaining supply lines of 30,000 tons a day into Normandy, far beyond German capacity to disrupt Operation Quicksilver. The deception supporting Garcia's work was possible only because of this industrial abundance. Real steel, rubber, and manpower-built dummy landing craft, inflatable tanks, and fake airfields, resources Germany could never have spared. U.S. factories produced over 2 million vehicles annually, more than 49,000 Sherman tanks by 1944, against fewer than 9,000 German. American electronics revolutionized coordination, while German shortages crippled command and control. American manpower advantages were equally decisive. Millions of industrial workers remained at their machines, while Germany relied on forced labor and dwindling reserves. Productivity, morale, and organization gave democracies overwhelming superiority. By July 25th, Operation Cobra had broken through, leading within weeks to the liberation of Paris. German armor still sat idle in Calais, paralyzed by Garcia's deception and belief in American capacity for vast simultaneous operations. Venezuela, 1988. Juan Pujol García, the spy known as Garbo, lived quietly, his role long hidden. The tarnished telegraph key he had used still remained, symbol of the more than 500 false reports that immobilized German reserves after D-Day. His success lay in confirming what German officers already believed, that America's industrial power could support enormous armies. The numbers made his fabrications credible. By war's end, America produced nearly 300,000 aircraft and over 200,000 tanks, while Germany built fewer than half those totals. Even Garcia's most ambitious lies seemed plausible against real abundance. His deception kept German divisions away from Normandy, saving thousands of Allied lives and hastening liberation. The more War proved that democratic industry outmatched totalitarian. Efficiency. U.S. factories that built tanks and aircraft later produced consumer goods that reshaped global prosperity. Garcia's story demonstrated how imagination, supported by industrial power, shaped history. As evening fell in Caracas, Garcia could reflect with quiet pride. His deception had mattered, but American industrial democracy had made Allied victory inevitable. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.